Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. The thorny issue of immigration is never far from the surface of British politics. The Immigration Minister Damien Green said recently that people coming to live in the UK from outside the EU must, in his words, add to the quality of life in Britain. It comes as the government's Migration Advisory Committee appeared to cast doubt on the economic benefits of immigration, concluding that for every 100 migrants coming to the UK from outside the EU, there were 23 fewer jobs for British workers. But it's often an emotive debate in which the facts can be obscured by sensational headlines. So what are the economic realities underpinning immigration? And is the government's plan to cut net migration workable or even desirable? Is it even possible to have a reasoned debate about immigration policy in the UK? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio in London by Dr. Carlos Vargas Silva. He's Senior Researcher at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Gawain Toler is Chief Spokesman for the UK Independence Party and a London Assembly candidate. And Kerry Dingle is Director of World Bites, an online citizen TV channel. Dr. Vargas Silva, let me come to you first. As I said in the introduction, there's quite a lot of emotion surrounding this debate. But if you could just provide us with a snapshot of what the immigration picture has been over, say, the last 10 years.
I think in order to understand what is happening now, you have to start by defining what is net migration, which is the target of the government. Basically, the government wants to decrease net migration, which is the difference between inflows of migrants to the UK and outflows of migrants to the UK from the current value or current level, which is 252,000, to less than 100,000. So they will have to cut the migration by more than half. Now, who counts as a migrant in this definition? In this definition, you have anyone that is entering the UK after living 1 year or more abroad. So basically, a British person that is coming back to UK after living 2 years in Canada, let's say, is going to be counted as an immigrant under this definition. Moreover, you also have included in here European citizens, which under the European Union Treaty have free access to the UK. So basically, this definition includes a lot of people for which the UK government doesn't have currently control. And in some sense also, if more British people were to leave the UK, then this will put the government closer to their target. Now, usually British people leave the UK, so there's negative net migration. So basically there's more people, British people leaving than coming to live in the UK. What is happening during the last few years is that less British people are leaving the country. As a result, net migration has been much higher than in the past. In fact, the value of 250,000 is the highest value on record for a calendar year. So it's a big challenge for the government because they will have to start with the highest value on record in order to increase net migration to the tens of thousands.
Its aim to cut it from its current level to tens of thousands or 100,000. I mean, is that aim actually even achievable?
Everything is achievable. Now, given the policies that they have currently in place and the approach that they have taken, is that they're not going to just cut students or just cut workers. They're going to do a comprehensive package in which they're going to cut different flows of people. Even the approach that they are taking and the numbers that they're cutting and the policies that they have in place is going to be very challenging for them to reach the target of 100,000 by the end of this parliament. So given the policies in place right now, it is unlikely that they're going to hit the target.
Gawain Toler, let me come to you. UKIP's view on non-EU migrants is the numbers should be cut?
We find the split between non-EU and EU migration somewhat bizarre. The government's position is that if, as you stated in your introduction, that for every 100 non-EU migrants, 23 jobs somehow have vanished from the British workforce. How they then say that EU migration, this impact is not there, to us seems bizarre. So we hold migration to be a single package, not two separate packages. Now, of course, our membership of the EU precludes us having any right or say over being able to control migration from EU countries. However, to try and pretend they're different things is bizarre. Also, in an odd way, UKIP, because we see ourselves in the way we do, we regard migration from the former Commonwealth probably with a lot greater favour than we do from those countries which we do not have historical ties, duties, responsibilities. So we find that the rules governing migration vis-a-vis EU and non-EU somewhat discriminatory against those of colour. You're talking about white migration and non-white migration.
So you would be in favour of just a blanket cut in the overall number if it were possible to do so?
But as I say, we actually, possibly oddly, we favour non-EU migration over EU migration because of those ties that bind, those historical links and responsibilities.
Do you accept that migrants who come to this country add very much to the economy, culture and society of the UK?
Some do, but I wouldn't say we accept that as a blanket. No, not in any way. And I don't think that... I'd put it this way. Me, nice middle-class chap, migration has been a wonderful boon. Prices for services have dropped considerably. I can have a cleaner, I can have a garden, I can get my plumbing done, I can do this, that and the other. For the wealthy, migration is an unalloyed good thing. For the government, it's brought down inflation and things of this sort. Now, put yourself in the position of the British working class. It's an entirely different ballgame. They are driven out of their jobs, the wages that they get are reduced, the queues for housing is greater, the impact on services provided by councils is far worse. So those who make decisions, i.e. people like me, the middle class, it's wonderful. Those who have decisions made for them, it ain't so good. And they've been forgotten.
How do you respond to critics of UKIP's policy who say that it's essentially tinged with racism?
They're absurd. It is not tinged with racism. It is. That would suggest that it is a matter of colour. It is not a matter of colour. It is a matter of capacity.
Carrie Dingle, in terms of the trends that we're looking at, what has your organisation been finding in terms of migration and the impact or contribution of migrants in this country?
Well, with World Bites and our charity that set up World Right, we've always supported open borders, and I don't think that's an unrealistic outlook. It's very interesting, in fact, that at the moment, with all the banker bashing and bashing, rich people's pay and bonuses, and demanding, something be done about inequality, which is very trendy for politicians and the media and the middle class, in fact, the enforced political inequality that's faced by migrants is something that Britain is extremely good at. It suggests to me that the obsession with inequality is about making us all make sacrifices given the way they treat non-EU migrants, which is to criminalise them, when, in fact, if you look historically and today at migration from anywhere in the world, it represents betterment. It represents striving for a better life, not accepting your fate. And I think that's a very inspiring thing. And far from working class people being xenophobic and racist or anything like that, I don't think they are. And I don't think UKIP is saying they are either. But I think we've seen a lot of establishment bashing of British working class people with the immigration issue. And I think there's plenty of working class people, and we meet them all of the time, who are actually very pro-migration and want us all to have a better life. And that would be a better message.
Just to clarify something you said your organisation was in favour of open borders.
Absolutely.
By that you mean essentially anyone who wished to come to this country should be able to?
Yeah, I think freedom of movement is absolutely fundamental, and it has been, a great thing historically in building the new world and, making us what we are.
Go in, you want us to come in?
Theoretically, freedom of movement of people, absolute freedom of open borders is wonderful. But, as plenty of people brighter than I have pointed out, you can't have a welfare state and free movement of people simultaneously. And you're going to have to make a decision. That's politics for you.
Unless you support growing the cake. And that's the problem. We haven't really got a pro-growth vision from any of our politicians. Everything is about austerity, have less, do less. And blaming numbers is also myopic. There's no relationship between poverty and population size or density, is there?
There is. I dispute that quite strongly. I don't believe you can, as I said, I don't think you can have a welfare state, which is, after all, there to support those at the bottom of the pile who need the help, and open borders. Because if you have free migration from a country of GDP X to a country of GDP 3 times that, you are going to have a disbalance, and the people in the country where people are coming to, such in this case UK, are going to have to pay the balance. And that, in a time of rising taxes and a time of greater austerity, is problematic.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the issue of immigration in the UK with my guests Carlos Vargas Silva, Gawain Toller and Kerry Dingle. Gawain Toller, when you look at countries like the United States and Germany, or France even as examples, countries which have large immigrant populations, the US in particular, they have been very successful in transforming themselves into places where people can come from other countries in order to pursue a better life, entrepreneurialism, contributing to the economy and so on. Don't we want the UK to be able to do the same thing?
I think historically you would say that Britain has. And I think the last time we saw it's a sort of almost pre-2004 EU enlargement and post. The last great migration to the UK was probably the Ugandan Asians in the mid-70s. 27,000 people, one could say, is probably the most successful group of migrants to this country in history. If one looks at the impact they've had on our society and the success they've made, and remember, they came with one bag of clothes after Amin kicked them out, there you have a very good example. But that was 27,000 people. You're getting that in a few months now, every few months. So, or 250,000 last year. So it's not like with like. I think in the case of America, yes, but it also has a very different attitude to the welfare state. For example, there is a love of entrepreneurship. There's no fear of failure, and therefore there's a greater desire for success. Whereas we have a fear of failure.
Carlo on this though, because if you look at the facts around the world, you know, this idea that we're going to somehow the floodgates would be opened and Britain would be overrun and there'd be no jobs. Obviously, first off, that's to blame the failures of social services and house building and all the things we all need on numbers and migrants, which, again, I think there's so little evidence of. But if what Carlo is saying on actual movement, isn't it the case, for example, that only about 3% of the global population move from their home, friends and family each year? So it's very small, because it's a huge thing to do, to rip yourself out of what you're used to go somewhere else, have to speak another language and start again. It's a very brave and quite inspiring thing to do. But the other thing is, if you look at the huge shifts in population, you look at, say, for example, within China, and the shift is from country to town, again, based on people's aspirations for a better life. And there's no evidence that it's caused chaos. And there is a failure of the historical imagination, a closing down of what's possible. And, you know, this idea of blaming our lack of services on people from elsewhere is mind-bogglingly sad.
In fact, the 250,000 is about net migration. If you look at immigration, was almost 600,000 for 2010. So you get about 50,000 migrants every month in average. Now, when you look at the impact of migration, you have to look about the level. You have to differentiate by the level that you're looking at. For instance, if you look at global levels, migration has a very, very positive effect on welfare levels at the global level. But this effect is to a large degree based on the rising income of migrants themselves, that usually often move from poor countries to richer countries. If you look at a country like the UK and you look at migration, probably migration is going to have a big impact on economic growth in the UK, and it's going to be positive. Now, that doesn't mean that migration has a positive impact for everyone in the UK. So it is likely that for some sectors of the population, probably low-skilled workers, there's going to be a negative effect of migration.
It would be fair to say, would it not, that public opinion in this country is largely negative when it comes to perceptions about immigration?
It's not only negative, it's one of the countries, when you compare across countries, usually the British public is more opposed to migration than the public in other similar countries in other countries. Now, the problem with these surveys is that they do not distinguish between types of migrants. Once you start distinguishing between types of migrants, you see that the public is really opposed to certain migrants. Like there is a very strong opposition against asylum seekers. They're very strong opposed to those, but they're less opposed to high-skilled migrants. So it really depends on what type of migrant are you looking at.
And that doesn't seem to be related to the economic situation in the country, because I suppose there's a natural temptation to say, look, as the economy worsens, attitudes towards immigrants and migrants also worsen. However, that doesn't really seem to be the case based on your bad immigration policy in the UK. To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio in London by Dr. Carlos Vargas Silva. He's senior researcher at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Gawain Toler is chief spokesman for the UK Independence Party and a London Assembly candidate. And Kerry Dingle is director of World Bites, an online citizen TV channel. Dr. Vargas Silva, let me come to you first. As I said in the introduction, concluding that for every 100 migrants coming to the UK from outside the EU, there were 23 fewer jobs for British workers. But it's often an emotive debate in which the facts can be obscured by sensational headlines. So what are the economic realities underpinning immigration? And is the government's plan to cut net migration workable or even desirable? Is it even possible to have a reasoned debate? And there's quite a lot of emotion surrounding this debate. But if you could just provide us with a snapshot of what the immigration picture has been over, say, the last 10 years.
I think in order to understand what is happening now, you have to start by defining what is net migration, which is the target of the government. Basically, the government wants to decrease net migration, which is the difference between inflows of migrants to the UK.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. The thorny issue of immigration is never far from the surface of British politics. The Immigration Minister Damien Green said recently that people coming to live in the UK from outside the EU must, in his words, add to the quality of life in Britain. It comes as the government's Migration Advisory Committee appear to cast doubt on the economic benefits of immigration.
And outflows of migrants to the UK is from the current value or current level, which is 252,000, to less than 100,000. So they will have to cut the migration by more than half. Now, who counts as a migrant in this definition? In this definition, you have anyone that is entering the UK after living 1 year or more abroad. So basically, a British person that is coming back to UK